When I saw my daughter standing in the hallway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't expect the question that came out of her mouth. "Were you at the club this morning?" she asked, too calmly. My heart skipped a beat, not because I was caught in a lie, at least not yet, but because her tone held something sharper than suspicion. It held knowledge. I opened my mouth to respond, but she continued. "I called them. You weren't on the schedule." I froze. The lie I'd told earlier about an early training session clung to the air between us like smoke. My daughter's gaze cut through me. "So," she said slowly, "where were you?" My lips parted, but no sound came out. Her phone lit up in her hand, an incoming message. She didn't check it right away. Just held it up, letting me see the sender's name, a name I recognized all too well. And suddenly, I wasn't just a mother standing in her kitchen. I was a woman caught between two mirrors, one reflecting everything I wanted to forget, and the other everything I hadn't yet dared to admit. I swallowed hard. The silence between us grew heavier. She hadn't told her father. Not yet. But I could see it in her eyes. She was weighing the moment, balancing it between betrayal and leverage. And I realized, then, that my daughter had secrets too. Secrets I'd helped her cover. And if she knew about mine, what else did she know? 3 months ago, I made a mistake. The kind of mistake that doesn't erase itself with time. The kind that hides in quiet glances and restrained conversations. And now, everything I tried to contain was beginning to spill. But before I tell you how it all unraveled, before I confess what really happened, tell me in the comments, have you ever protected someone else's lie, only to have your own become the weapon they use against you? I used to think routine was safety. That the quiet rhythm of mornings, coffee brewing, slippers on tile, my husband's low voice reading headlines aloud, was enough to keep a marriage from unraveling. But I was wrong. Stillness doesn't always mean stability. Sometimes it means neglect. And love, once unattended, grows brittle at the edges. I remember the first time I felt it, really felt it, that something between us had turned to stone. It wasn't a fight or a betrayal. It was an evening like any other. We were watching television. A comedy, I think. My husband laughed at a line. I didn't. Not because it wasn't funny, but because I was too focused on how far apart we sat. Not just physically, but in every way that mattered. Our daughter had grown up. She no longer needed bedtime stories or packed lunches. She came and went with the air of someone living a parallel life. And my husband had buried himself in work, in schedules and spreadsheets, in things that made him feel needed. I, on the other hand, drifted. I cooked. I cleaned. I hosted the occasional dinner party. And I waited for what, I wasn't sure. It started with small things. Our daughter asking me to tell her father she was sleeping at a friend's house when she wasn't. Harmless, she said. Just one night. Then another. I didn't ask questions. I told myself she was old enough to make her own choices. That I was just doing what any mother would do, protecting her child. But then I started noticing the shift. Her lies grew bolder, more practiced. Her eyes darted when she spoke. And worse, she began to ask not just for my silence, but for my complicity. Just say I was with you, she whispered one night, slipping her shoes off at the front door after midnight. Please, Mom. Don't make it a thing. And I didn't. I nodded. I lied. I became the shield she needed. And for a while, it made me feel useful again. Needed. But that usefulness came with a price. With each lie I told for her, I felt a little further from the woman I used to be. A little more like a shadow in my own home. It was around that time that I returned to the club. I'd been a member years ago, yoga, Pilates, the occasional swim. Back then, I used to go just to feel like I was doing something for myself. Somewhere along the line, I'd stopped. But one afternoon, without really thinking, I put on my old leggings and walked through those glass doors again. I expected the same rows of treadmills, the smell of eucalyptus and sweat, the silence between strangers in motion. What I didn't expect was him. He wasn't particularly handsome. Not in a magazine cover kind of way. But there was something grounded in his voice, the way he spoke to people, calm and deliberate. He wasn't a boy, not some smooth-talking flirt. He was a man who observed before he acted. He didn't notice me that first day. Why would he? I stayed quiet, kept to the machines. But I noticed him. And the next day, when I came back, I timed my routine around when I saw him walk through the weights section. Pathetic? Maybe. But it gave my day shape. It gave me something to think about that wasn't silence or spreadsheets or another whispered lie from my daughter. One morning, I dropped my water bottle. It rolled across the floor, hitting the edge of a nearby mat. He picked it up. Handed it to me with a small smile. "You've got a strong stride," he said, nodding toward the treadmill I'd just stepped off. I laughed, too surprised not to. "You must be confusing me with someone else." "No," he replied, without looking away. "I don't think I am." It wasn't a flirt. Not exactly. But it lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest. I walked out of the club that day feeling lighter. Scene. That night at dinner, my husband mentioned a new project. Something overseas. He spoke for 20 minutes about logistics, contracts, currencies. I nodded, smiled. Pretended to understand. Our daughter picked at her food. The three of us, sharing a table, but not a conversation. Later, while loading the dishwasher, I asked him if he wanted to take a walk. "Too tired," he said, without glancing up from his laptop. "Maybe this weekend." I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. I wasn't angry. Just hollow. I thought about the man at the club. His voice. His eyes. The way he said I had a strong stride. The next morning, I was back at the gym. I wore perfume, not much, just enough to feel like I had a secret. And when he walked past me again, our eyes met. Something shifted. Something small. But irreversible. The next few days blurred together, though I wouldn't have admitted that to anyone at the time. Something had shifted inside me, quietly, subtly, but undeniably. I woke earlier, paid more attention to what I wore. I told myself it was about health, about rediscovering some version of myself I had let dissolve in the ordinary. But that wasn't the whole truth. The truth had a name, a face, and a calm, level voice that now echoed somewhere in the back of my mind. The club became my orbit. Not obsessively, not dramatically, but with the pull of something gentle and constant. I rearranged errands to coincide with my gym schedule. I looked forward to the weight of the mat beneath my feet, the mirrored walls, the smell of rubber and eucalyptus. The space gave me an illusion of control, like the hours I spent there weren't stolen or wrong, but deserved. I started attending the smaller group classes. He led them sometimes, adjusting stances, correcting posture. Always professional, always brief. Yet I could sense when he lingered just a second too long. Or when his hand guided my shoulder with just enough pressure to make my pulse catch. He never crossed any lines. But I was already stepping across mine. At home, life continued, unchanged and unaware. My husband left early, came back late. His days were meetings and spreadsheets, his nights headphones and news reports. Our daughter became harder to track. She slipped out after dinner, came home quietly. No explanations, no lies, because I'd stopped asking. One evening, I was folding laundry when my phone lit up with a message. It wasn't from him, he never messaged me. But it was from the club. A schedule update. A small detail, he'd be covering the early morning class. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. The next morning, I arrived before sunrise. The parking lot was nearly empty. I sat in the car for a few minutes, questioning everything, my intentions, my appearance, my sanity. But I went in. And he was there, setting out mats in silence, nodding when he saw me. We barely spoke. The class moved fast. My body followed, but my mind wandered. Every adjustment he made felt loaded. Not inappropriate, just charged, electric in a way I hadn't expected. And then, as we left, the rain began. It came suddenly, thick, steady drops on the pavement. I paused under the awning, holding my gym bag, unsure what to do. That's when I saw him again, walking toward his car. He stopped, looked back at me, then walked over. "You driving?" he asked, glancing at my soaked hair. "No," I replied. "My husband took the car this morning." "Come on," he said, nodding toward his car. "I'll give you a ride. You'll be drenched before the bus even shows." I hesitated. The right thing to do would have been to decline. Politely, with gratitude. But I didn't. I climbed in. His car was clean. Minimal. Quiet. The kind of silence that didn't beg to be filled. He drove without speaking, hands steady on the wheel. I watched the raindrops chase each other across the window. My pulse beat in my throat. At the third red light, he turned slightly, eyes still on the road. "You look different lately," he said. "Different how?" "Lighter. Like something let go." I didn't answer. My throat felt tight. My fingers clenched the strap of my bag. The light turned green. We drove in silence for another block. And then it happened. At the next stoplight, when the rain softened and the world felt temporarily paused, he looked at me fully. No smile, no suggestion. Just a question in his eyes. And without speaking, without planning, I leaned forward. We kissed. It wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even perfect. But it happened. And when I leaned back, breath shallow, the only sound was the quiet hush of the rain on the windshield. He didn't speak. Neither did I. He drove me home in silence. I climbed out without looking back. Inside the house, I was greeted by the scent of brewed coffee and the distant sound of a news anchor. My husband was already at the table, eyes on his laptop. He looked up, offered a distracted smile, then returned to his screen. I walked upstairs, closed the bedroom door, and sat on the edge of the bed. What had I done? The question burned through me, but not with shame. Not yet. It was something closer to awe. To fear. To possibility. I didn't know what came next. I didn't have a plan. But for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. Later that night, as I folded my gym clothes, I noticed something small but strange. A faint scent clung to the fabric, not perfume, not sweat. Just something warm, familiar. I paused, held the shirt close to my face, and closed my eyes. Downstairs, the television hummed. The dishwasher clicked. My husband yawned. And upstairs, I sat with the weight of a kiss I couldn't take back. We kissed. And everything changed. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. Not because I liked what I saw, but because I needed to recognize myself. I turned slightly, pulled my hair back, adjusted my blouse. Nothing revealing. Nothing loud. Just different. Subtle choices that felt intentional, as if I were preparing for something I couldn't name. The reflection looked back at me, curious and unsure. Downstairs, my husband sipped his coffee and muttered something about an early meeting. I nodded, poured myself a cup, and stirred slowly. The clink of the spoon against ceramic sounded louder than usual. Our daughter walked in, scrolling on her phone, barely glancing up. We moved like planets in separate orbits, crossing paths but never colliding. I told them both I'd be at the club for a late class. Neither asked questions. They never did. I left the house with a bag that felt heavier than it should have, though it held nothing out of the ordinary. When I arrived, he wasn't there. I kept my head down during the session, letting the rhythm of movement dull the static inside me. But I felt his absence like a missing note in a song I had just started learning. When class ended, I lingered in the locker room, as if he might appear suddenly in the hallway, as if the universe might hand me another coincidence. But there was no coincidence that day. Instead, there was my daughter. She was waiting for me at home. Not with curiosity, but calculation. I found her leaning against the counter, arms folded, eyes fixed. "You were at the club?" she asked, tone too smooth. I hesitated. "Yes." She raised an eyebrow. "That's funny." I checked the schedule. "Your class wasn't listed." My breath hitched, just enough for her to notice. "Why would you lie?" she asked, not angrily, but slowly, like someone unraveling a knot. I didn't respond. What could I say? That I was chasing silence? That I was trying to find a version of myself not tethered to them? She pulled out her phone and waved it slightly. "You want to explain why his name is in your messages?" My throat tightened. "He didn't text me," I said, finally. "It was a class alert." She shook her head, smiled without warmth. "You really think I'm that stupid?" There was something dangerous in her voice, not rage, but precision. She'd done her homework. She knew more than she was saying. And suddenly, I was the one under scrutiny. The roles had reversed. I asked if she'd told her father. "No," she said. "Not yet." I waited. I thought she might threaten me. Cry. Demand the truth. But what she said instead was far more calculated. "I want a car." My breath left me. "I've been quiet, respectful. But if you want me to stay quiet, I want a car. Nothing crazy. Just fair." I stared at her, unable to speak. This wasn't just manipulation, it was a transaction. My daughter had weaponized my silence, and now, she held the balance of power. She picked up her bag and walked toward the stairs. "Let me know by the weekend." I remained in the kitchen, hands resting on the edge of the counter, staring at the space where she had stood. My daughter. My child. I had taught her to tell the truth, to be kind, to listen. And now here she was, using my weakness as currency. And the worst part? I wasn't even angry at her. I was angry at myself for giving her the tools. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the kiss. About the moment that had pulled the thread, unraveling more than I had anticipated. I didn't regret it. That was the strangest part. I regretted being caught. I regretted the carelessness. But the kiss itself, it had been real. I thought about my husband, asleep beside me, breathing steadily. What would he say if he knew? Would he be shocked? Or would he finally admit that he hadn't really seen me in years? The next morning, I wrote the check. It wasn't for a luxury car, just enough for something practical. I placed it in a plain envelope and slid it under her door. No note. No conversation. By evening, the money was gone. She didn't thank me. I didn't expect her to. We moved through the week in silence, polite but distant. The envelope was the new unspoken contract between us. She wouldn't mention what she knew, and I wouldn't ask where she went at night. At the club, I saw him again. He was alone in one of the back rooms, setting up mats. I stood at the threshold, unsure if I should enter. But he looked up and gave a small nod. "You missed Monday," he said. I stepped inside slowly. I had some things to deal with. He adjusted a strap on one of the resistance bands, eyes focused. "Everything all right?" "Not really," I admitted. He paused, then straightened. For a moment, he studied me, not with judgment, but with a kind of patient awareness. Then he said, "Sometimes we move too fast. Even when we think we're standing still." I nodded, not sure what else to say. The room smelled faintly of citrus and sweat. The lights buzzed overhead. I wanted to say something meaningful, something to bridge the space between us, but I didn't know how. He didn't press. Instead, he walked past me toward the exit. At the door, he paused. "Take care of yourself," he said. And then he was gone. I stood there alone, surrounded by the stillness of the empty studio. I didn't follow him. I didn't call after him. I just stood there, listening to the echo of my own choices. That night, as I brushed my hair in the bathroom mirror, I caught my own gaze. The woman looking back at me wasn't broken. She wasn't evil. But she wasn't innocent either. I had crossed a line. And now, someone else was holding the pen. It rained the next morning. Not the kind of gentle drizzle that hangs politely in the background, but a steady, heavy rhythm that seemed to press on the windows and blur the edges of everything. I stood by the kitchen sink, cradling my mug in both hands, watching drops slide down the glass. My daughter had already left. My husband was upstairs, on another video call, his voice muffled behind a closed door. The house felt hollow. Or maybe I did. I hadn't returned to the club since that last conversation. Not out of shame, at least, not entirely, but because I didn't trust myself. I was starting to understand that desire wasn't the problem. It was the space it created. A space that made everything else in my life feel thinner, more fragile, less real. Still, I told myself I needed air. A walk. Movement. Anything. I put on a coat, pulled the hood up, and stepped outside without a plan. The streets were quiet. My shoes slapped against the wet pavement with every step, and I welcomed the feeling, something tangible, something I could count on. I didn't realize where I was going until I arrived. The club looked exactly as it always had, mirrored glass, polished stone steps, a faint smell of detergent and ambition. But inside, it felt different. Less like a place to escape and more like a place where things had changed. He wasn't at the front desk. I didn't expect him to be. I moved past the check-in, toward the private rooms. Not to find him, but to find familiarity. To anchor myself. I didn't expect anything. I just needed to stand somewhere that had once made me feel something. As I passed the stretching room, I paused. He was there. Not teaching. Just standing by the window, arms folded, staring out at the rain. His reflection wavered in the glass. He didn't turn when I entered. "I didn't think I'd see you again," he said after a long moment. "I wasn't sure if I should come. Yet here you are." Silence settled. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't comfortable either. I stepped closer, resting my hand lightly on the edge of the window frame. "I'm not here for anything." "I know." I paused. Everything's starting to feel unreal. He turned then, slowly, meeting my eyes. There was no warmth there, but no judgment either. Just clarity. "You're not the only one carrying more than you expected," he said. I wanted to ask what he meant. But I didn't. Maybe because I was afraid of the answer. Maybe because I already knew. He looked at me for a moment longer, then stepped away. "I have a class in 5 minutes," he said. Not dismissive. Just final. I nodded and left. Outside, the rain had turned to mist, but it soaked through my coat all the same. I walked home slower than usual, as if dragging my feet might keep time from moving forward. But it did. It always does. That evening, I made dinner without thinking. Chopped onions, stirred sauce, listened to the quiet shuffle of my husband moving around upstairs. I didn't ask if he'd join us. I never did anymore. My daughter arrived late. She dropped her bag by the door and kicked off her shoes with the casual defiance I'd grown used to. I didn't say anything. I just served her plate and returned to my own. Halfway through the meal, she looked up. "Thanks," she said. I blinked. "For what?" "For the car." I nodded, unsure what to do with her tone, half genuine, half mocking. Then she said, "You know, I didn't think you'd actually do it." "I said I would," I replied. She pushed food around on her plate. "I thought you might tell Dad instead. Make a mess. Blow everything up." I met her eyes. "That's not who I am." She smiled slightly. "No. You're the kind who keeps things quiet." The words stung more than they should have. But I let them pass. I was learning that silence could be both weapon and refuge. Later, I stood in the laundry room folding towels when I heard my husband's voice behind me. "Is everything all right?" I turned. He leaned against the doorway, watching me carefully. "Why do you ask?" "You've been different." I shrugged. "A lot's been on my mind." He stepped closer, but not too close. "If there's something you want to talk about." "There isn't," I said, perhaps too quickly. He nodded, but didn't leave. "You know I trust you." The words hung in the air. Not heavy, not loaded. Just there. And suddenly, I felt tired. Not just physically, but somewhere deeper. The kind of tired that settles in your bones when you realize you've been pretending not to feel something for too long. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the sound of rain returning, softer now. I thought about the man at the club. About my daughter. About the silent contract we were both living under. About my husband's voice saying, "I trust you." Trust. It's such a simple word. 4 letters. But it carries the weight of entire lifetimes. I closed my eyes and turned toward the wall. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, everything I had built to keep myself from unraveling was starting to come apart, thread by thread. The following week unfolded in slow, fragmented pieces. I moved through each day as if walking through water, everything felt heavier, more deliberate. The air inside the house had changed. I could feel it. There was an edge to every word spoken, even the most mundane exchanges. No one said anything outright, but we were all holding something beneath the surface, and it was beginning to show in the silences. On Tuesday, I found an unfamiliar envelope on the kitchen counter. No name, just a dealership logo. Inside, a receipt for a down payment. My daughter had acted quickly. I expected her to gloat, to say something smug over breakfast, but she didn't. She just poured herself cereal and scrolled through her phone like nothing had shifted. But it had. The dynamic between us was no longer mother and daughter, it was something colder, transactional. We were bound by secrets now, and neither of us had the upper hand for long. I realized she no longer looked at me with disappointment. She looked at me with recognition. As if I had finally fallen from the pedestal she had never wanted to admit existed. I returned to the club on Thursday. It was mid-morning, quieter than usual. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the front desk attendant barely looked up as I signed in. I told myself I was there for clarity. For control. But I knew better. He was in the smaller studio, adjusting resistance straps and wiping down equipment. When I entered, he didn't stop what he was doing. He only nodded, a barely perceptible acknowledgement. I placed my bag down in the corner and stood near the mirrored wall, pretending to stretch, watching him through the reflection. He looked tired. Distracted. There was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. I knew better than to assume it had anything to do with me, but the thought still flickered. When our eyes met in the mirror, I spoke before I could think. Have I made things worse for you? He didn't answer right away. Just kept working the strap, then finally straightened and turned. Worse, he repeated. No. Just complicated. I nodded. That's fair. We stood in that room for a few seconds too long, either of us moving. Then he said, sometimes people show up hoping for something simple, but life doesn't offer that very often. No, I agreed. It doesn't. His tone softened. Are you okay? I don't know, I said. I've been trying to feel like myself again. But I'm starting to think I don't know who that is anymore. There was no pity in his expression, just a quiet understanding. He didn't try to console me. He didn't step forward. He just listened. Then he said the last thing I expected. Come with me tomorrow. There's a wellness conference. I'm speaking at a panel. It's out of town, nothing formal, just something different. I blinked. You're inviting me? I am. You don't have to say yes. I hesitated. Every reasonable part of me screamed that it was a bad idea. But something in me, something more ancient, more visceral, said yes before I could stop it. I'll go. We agreed on a time. He'd drive. I didn't ask where we were going. It didn't seem to matter. What mattered was the pull, the gravity that had slowly been building between us since that first encounter. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, the sheets tangled around my legs, my heart unsteady. I kept thinking about the invitation, about what it meant, and about what it didn't. I wasn't naive. I didn't expect declarations or resolutions. I just needed to feel, needed to remember what it was like to choose something without hesitation. The next morning, I told my husband I had a volunteer retreat with the club. He nodded, distracted by his phone. He barely looked up from the screen. My daughter was still asleep when I left. I paused outside her door, considered knocking. But I didn't. The drive was quiet at first. He played music, instrumental, low, calming. We didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like an unspoken agreement not to ruin the moment with unnecessary words. The highway blurred past us. Fields, trees, distant signs. I watched the sky shift colors, the clouds slowly giving way to a reluctant sun. We stopped once for coffee. He ordered for both of us, without asking, and handed me the cup like it was a familiar routine. I took it with a nod, sipped, and tasted something warm and grounding. It wasn't just about caffeine. It was about recognition. By midday, we arrived at the venue. A modest conference center on the edge of a quiet town. Inside, rows of chairs, low voices, pamphlets. He disappeared briefly to check in, and I wandered through the lobby, collecting brochures I wouldn't read. When he returned, he led me through a side hallway to a small lounge area where the panelists waited. He introduced me only as a guest. No labels. No explanations. I appreciated that more than I could say. The panel lasted just under an hour. I watched from the back as he spoke, calm, confident, composed. His words were measured, thoughtful. He spoke about the psychology of movement, about how people carry trauma in the body, how release can come through unexpected forms. I listened more closely than I intended to. When it ended, we didn't stay long. He suggested lunch outside the venue. We found a quiet cafe tucked between two bookstores. The kind of place with handwritten menus and mismatched chairs. We talked more there than we ever had. Not about us, never directly, but about life, about choices, about change. He told me about his father, about how he'd once thought he'd become a writer. I told him about the piano lessons I quit at 13, about the way I sometimes dream in color when everything in my waking life feels gray. The hours passed quickly. When we returned to the car, we sat for a long moment without turning the engine on. He looked at me. You don't owe me anything. I know. I just wanted to give you something different. Even if it's only for today. I nodded. Thank you. The ride back was slower. The sky had shifted again, clouds gathering. I stared out the window, fingers tracing the seam of the seat. He dropped me off a few blocks from home, just as the first drops of rain began to fall. I stood on the curb, watching his car disappear around the corner. I didn't move right away. When I finally walked toward the house, I felt the weight of everything I hadn't said. The things I had left behind that morning were still waiting inside, intact, unchanged. But something in me had shifted again. And I knew that no matter how carefully I tread, I was already too far from where I'd started to go back. I walked into the house that evening and was immediately struck by how ordinary everything looked. The hallway lights glowed softly, the faint hum of the dishwasher buzzed in the background, and the faint aroma of garlic from an unfinished dinner lingered in the air. Nothing had changed, except me. I stood by the front door for a moment longer than necessary, letting the quiet settle around me, letting it test me. My daughter was in the living room, legs tucked under her as she scrolled through something on her phone. She didn't look up when I passed. I didn't expect her to. Upstairs, the bedroom light was on. I climbed the steps slowly, not knowing why I felt so reluctant to enter my own space. My husband was already in bed, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, the soft light from his lamp casting shadows on the page in his hands. "You're home late," he said without looking up. "There was traffic," I replied. He hummed an acknowledgement, turning a page. "You missed dinner. I saved you a plate." "Thanks." He didn't ask anything more. I didn't offer anything more. That was our rhythm now, polite exchanges, no trespassing into territory too vulnerable to touch. I changed quietly, washed up, and slipped into bed beside him. We lay a few inches apart, both pretending that sleep came easily. But it didn't. My thoughts looped. Not with guilt or panic, but with complexity. I kept seeing the way he'd looked at me earlier that day, the way his words had held no expectations. "You don't owe me anything." I repeated it in my mind until the words started to twist. Because I did owe someone something. Not him. Not even myself, really. But the people in my life who still believed I was exactly who I used to be. I drifted in and out of sleep that night. Images flickered behind my eyelids, a stretch of highway, a cup of coffee, a look that said too much. Each time I opened my eyes, I expected the dark to settle differently around me, but it never did. The house was still, like it was holding its breath. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of rain tapping gently against the windows. My husband was already gone, another early meeting, another day begun without a word between us. I made coffee in silence, watching the steam rise from the cup like a ghost of something forgotten. My daughter emerged just as I was finishing the last sip. "You left early yesterday," she said, voice casual. "I had an event," I replied. She didn't press. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said more than her words ever could. She didn't trust me anymore, but she also didn't seem to care. That hurt more than I expected. Later that day, as I was folding laundry in the bedroom, I noticed my husband's laptop on the dresser. It was open, the screen still glowing from sleep mode. I didn't mean to look. But something about the way it sat there, unguarded, waiting, invited me in. I walked over slowly. The screen brightened. No password. A folder on the desktop blinked, labeled simply miscellaneous. My heart knocked once, hard. I clicked. Inside were a series of emails. Receipts. Booked appointments. Correspondences I didn't recognize. And then, photos. Blurry, distant, clearly taken without the subject's knowledge. But I knew what I was looking at. The club's back entrance. The hallway near the private rooms. A timestamp from the previous week. I felt my pulse in my throat. I closed the laptop and backed away, not because I was afraid he knew, because I suddenly understood he already did. He wasn't distant because he didn't notice. He was distant because he was waiting. Watching. Maybe even collecting. My chest tightened, but not with fear, with anticipation. Something was coming. I didn't know what, or when, but I could feel the shape of it forming behind the stillness of our daily routine. That evening, he came home earlier than usual. He placed his briefcase down gently by the door and greeted my daughter with a brief, distracted smile. When he entered the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "How was your day?" he asked. I looked up from the cutting board. "Fine. Yours?" "Productive," he said. "Also, I wanted to tell you I'm planning something for my birthday. Something a bit different." I paused. "What kind of different?" "A dinner. Here. Family, a few friends. Nothing extravagant." I studied his face. It was neutral. Too neutral. "When?" "Next Friday." I nodded. "All right. Do you want help organizing it?" "No," he said. "I'll handle it." That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing my teeth and watching my own expression harden. I could feel the edges of his plan, even if I didn't know the details. He wasn't organizing a celebration. He was building a stage. For what, I could only imagine. I went to bed with a pit in my stomach and woke with it still there. In the following days, he became even more attentive, offering to do the dishes, asking about my schedule, listening more closely than usual. It wasn't reconciliation. It was positioning. He was preparing for something. And I didn't know whether to be terrified or relieved. I returned to the club once more before the end of the week. Not for training. Just to sit in the parking lot. I watched people come and go, bags slung over their shoulders, conversations fading into the drizzle. I never got out of the car. I thought about what it meant to be seen. Not observed, but truly seen. And how dangerous that could be. Because once someone sees you, really sees you, you can't hide anymore. Not from them. Not from yourself. The day of the birthday approached like a gathering storm. Quiet on the surface, but thick in the air with the promise of something irreversible. My husband didn't speak about it again. He didn't need to. Everything was already in motion. And I was beginning to understand that the calm we had lived in for so long wasn't peace. It was the silence before the break. The day before his birthday felt like the hush before a thunderstorm. The house was too quiet, too orderly. My husband moved through it with measured grace, asking short, polite questions, and offering help in ways that didn't feel like him, clearing plates, making small talk, organizing flower deliveries. He was planning everything with such calm precision that it unsettled me more than any outburst would have. I found myself checking the time constantly, though I had nowhere to be. I wandered from room to room as if trying to confirm that the furniture was still in place, that the ground beneath me hadn't shifted. But it had. I could feel it. My daughter was unusually cooperative, too. She didn't complain about the guest list or the timing, didn't slam doors or roll her eyes. She dressed neatly, even offered to help set the table. The two of them seemed locked in a dance I didn't understand, each step choreographed around me, never into me. It felt like being watched through a pane of glass. At one point, I passed by my husband's office and saw the screen of his laptop glowing faintly through the crack in the door. The sight sent a tremor through me, but I didn't stop. I didn't need to open it again. I already knew what I'd find. The truth, documented and time-stamped, waiting for its stage. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts were not coherent, they looped, rewound, drifted. I kept seeing my daughter at the kitchen counter, the envelope from the dealership, the folder on my husband's laptop, and the look in the trainer's eyes when he said, "Even if it's only for today." In the morning, I dressed slowly, choosing a blouse I hadn't worn in years. Something understated but graceful. Something I thought would make me feel like myself again, though I wasn't sure who that even was anymore. My reflection didn't give me answers. The house filled steadily over the next 2 hours. Relatives, old friends, colleagues. People I hadn't seen in years offered hugs and comments like "You haven't aged a day" or "You two always threw the best parties." I smiled. I nodded. I filled wine glasses and cleared empty plates. But I was watching. Watching him. He moved through the guests like a host trained for performance. His eyes touched everyone, but lingered on no one. Not even me. That was how I knew this wasn't a celebration. This was a conclusion. After the meal, people drifted into the living room, where a projector had been set up. I hadn't noticed it earlier. It was tucked discreetly in the corner, cables running beneath the rug. I stood frozen in the dining room, my hands still damp from the sink, as my husband tapped a spoon against a glass and called for attention. His voice was steady. Gracious. "Before dessert," he said, "I want to share something a little more personal. A look back at the last year. A small project I've been working on." The lights dimmed. At first, it was harmless. Pictures of family dinners. Trips. Old vacations stitched together with soft transitions and acoustic music. Laughter echoed through the room as familiar faces appeared on the wall. I stood near the archway, heart thudding in my chest, waiting for the moment I knew was coming. And then, without warning, the tone shifted. No music now. Just silence. The first new image was grainy. A parking lot. The entrance to the club. I heard a few murmurs, uncertain laughs. Another shot, me, exiting the club, walking to a car that wasn't mine. Then another. A hallway. The gym. A timestamp. Then a freeze frame. Just me. Standing near the mirror in the stretching room. And behind me, him. A voice from the crowd, "Wait, is that?" The projector clicked to the next slide. My daughter's face. With someone I didn't recognize. Laughing. Walking out of a building that was definitely not her school. Then another. And another. I stood still as stone. My breath shallow, my skin prickling. All around me, the room began to shift. Faces turned. Voices dropped. My husband remained still, beside the projector, one hand resting lightly on the remote. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. It was all there. The silence in the room was worse than shouting would have been. It wasn't outrage, it was revelation. The kind that spread slowly, landing on everyone like dust. My daughter was the first to break. "What the hell is this?" But her voice shook. She looked at me. Then at him. Then back at me. "You knew," she said. "You both knew." My husband stepped forward, addressing the room, not us. "I think that's enough for tonight. Thank you all for coming." There was no anger in his voice. No triumph. Just finality. Guests began gathering their coats. Quiet apologies drifted through the air like smoke. No one asked questions. They didn't have to. The room was already full of answers. My daughter stormed upstairs. I remained where I stood. When the last guest had left, and the front door clicked shut, the three of us were alone in the dimly lit house. I expected confrontation. But none came. My husband picked up a tray of empty glasses and carried it to the kitchen. I followed slowly, unsure of what to say. He turned on the tap, rinsed a glass, and said, "I didn't want to humiliate you. That wasn't the point." I watched the water spiral down the drain. "Then what was?" "To be done pretending," he said. "For all of us." I couldn't argue. Not because I agreed, but because I finally understood what he'd been doing all along. He hadn't been seeking revenge. He'd been building silence until it was loud enough to hear. That night, after the dishes were done and the lights were off, I sat alone in the kitchen. My daughter didn't come down. My husband didn't speak again. I listened to the tick of the clock above the stove and tried to imagine what tomorrow might feel like. But I couldn't. Because something had ended. And I wasn't sure what had taken its place. The morning after the birthday left the house in a strange kind of stillness. It wasn't quiet in the way Sunday mornings used to be, restful, soft, filled with the smell of coffee and the rustle of newspapers. This quiet felt brittle, like a surface that might crack under the wrong step. Every sound, while footsteps on the stairs, the click of a mug against the countertop, seemed amplified, sharper than it should have been. I woke before anyone else. Habit, maybe. Or maybe because sleep had become something I performed rather than experienced. I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window at the gray sky, my hands cradling a cup I had no interest in drinking. My reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar in the soft morning light. A little older. A little less certain. My daughter didn't come down for breakfast. I didn't call her. I figured she needed space, though I wasn't sure whether she wanted it from me or from the entire house. Maybe both. She had every right to be angry. I just didn't know which part of me she was angry at, the liar, the coward, or the mirror. My husband came down late. He was dressed for work, tie perfectly knotted, jacket crisp, face unreadable. He poured himself coffee without a word. We stood in the same kitchen we had shared for decades, separated by the island and something much larger. "I won't be home for dinner," he said after a moment. I nodded. Understood. He didn't ask about me. He didn't need to. I think he knew I had nowhere else to be. When he left, the silence settled again. Not oppressive, not punishing, just vacant. Like the house was trying to reset itself around the damage. I spent the day cleaning. Not because it was dirty, but because I needed to feel like I could fix something. I washed the same countertop 3 times. I folded laundry that didn't belong to me. I reorganized drawers I hadn't opened in months. And the whole time, a thought played on a loop in my mind: there's no going back. Not now. Not ever. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard the front door open. My daughter had left without a word and returned the same way. I didn't greet her. I didn't expect her to come to me. She moved through the hallway like a stranger passing through a hotel lobby. Upstairs, the door clicked shut. I returned to the sink, hands in warm water, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. I thought about the club. The weight room. The conference. The moment in the car when I had felt something resembling freedom. It hadn't been love, not even close. But it had been a door. A window. A way to breathe in a life that had become airtight. I dried the plate, stacked it with the others, and leaned against the counter. I didn't cry. There was nothing left in me that would come out as tears. Only a quiet, deep ache that pulsed at the edges of my thoughts. That evening, I ventured out. Just for a walk. Just to get away from the stillness. I wrapped a scarf around my neck, slipped on boots, and let the door fall shut behind me. The air was cold and damp, the sky heavy with the kind of clouds that promised nothing but more of the same. I walked aimlessly, passing houses I'd seen 1,000 times but had never really looked at. Eventually, I found myself near the club. Not close enough to be noticed. Just across the street, standing beside a tree whose leaves had mostly fallen. I watched people come and go, regulars, newcomers, staff. I didn't go in. I had no reason to. Whatever had been opened there was now closed. Not by force, but by timing. And silence. I stood there until my fingers began to sting from the cold. Then I turned and walked back. At home, the lights were off in the living room. Only the small lamp above the stairwell glowed faintly. My daughter's shoes were by the door. My husband's coat was gone. I moved through the house slowly, not wanting to disturb anything. I climbed the stairs, paused outside her door, then kept walking. In my own room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs was the only sound. No television. No voices. Just the low buzz of something mechanical, something unfeeling. I thought about calling someone. A friend. Anyone. But what would I say? That I had built my life carefully, obediently, and now stood inside its wreckage with no idea which piece to pick up first? Instead, I opened the closet. My eyes scanned the rows of clothes, organized by color, by season, by occasion. Dresses for dinners that never happened. Shoes for events that had passed without memory. I pulled out a coat I hadn't worn in years. Inside one of the pockets, I found a crumpled movie ticket. A matinee I had gone to alone when the house felt too loud to stay in. I smoothed the paper between my fingers. This is what a life becomes, I thought. Pieces. Objects. Ghosts of small choices that don't feel like choices at all. I folded the coat and set it aside. Not out of anger. Out of understanding. It no longer fit. The house was still again. I returned to the kitchen, made tea I didn't drink, and stood by the window as the sky darkened. And I realized something I hadn't let myself admit until that moment. It wasn't that I wanted to leave. It was that I had already left. And now I had to figure out where I'd gone. The next few days passed without definition. Time no longer felt linear but elastic, stretching, retracting, folding in on itself. I drifted from room to room like a guest overstaying her welcome. The house, once familiar, now felt like a gallery of carefully curated stillness. My footsteps echoed louder than they should have. The quiet had weight. My husband and I barely spoke. There was no tension in the silence, just a hollow formality. He moved with precision, tending to his routines as if they were obligations he no longer believed in. I, too, fulfilled my part: meals, laundry, light conversation when necessary. But we no longer occupied the same emotional space. We were actors playing a scene for an audience that had long since left the theater. My daughter, too, withdrew. We crossed paths, but she rarely met my eyes. Her silence was not hostile, it was dismissive. I had lost something in her, a sliver of reverence or belief that might never return. She no longer challenged me or demanded explanations. She simply existed near me without recognition, and somehow that hurt more than if she had screamed. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the hallway closet, staring at a stack of photo albums I hadn't touched in years. I pulled one down and opened it on the dining table. Inside were fragments of another life. Smiling vacations. School plays. Birthday cakes lit with candles I can no longer count. I stared at one photo, our daughter at 10, braces barely visible, hugging her father's waist. I sat with that image for a long time, tracing her face with my eyes. I remembered that day. It had rained earlier, and the air had that damp, sweet scent that comes only after a summer storm. We'd eaten lunch outside under a patio umbrella. My husband had held her hand while she walked along the stones lining the garden. I had watched them, camera in hand, thinking I should capture the moment. So I did. But no photograph could preserve the softness of that afternoon. And yet, even then, I'd felt a flicker of distance. The beginnings of a disconnection I couldn't name. A sense that we were performing the idea of closeness, rather than inhabiting it. I closed the album and pushed it aside. That night, my husband came home late. I heard the garage door open and close, heard the soft creak of his shoes on the hardwood. I didn't go down to greet him. Instead, I sat by the window in the guest room, looking out into the yard. The branches swayed gently in the dark, brushing against the glass like fingers trying to find their way in. When I finally turned in, I found him already asleep. His breathing was slow and even, his body curled toward the far edge of the bed. I watched him for a moment, then lay down without making a sound. At some point in the night, I dreamed I was standing in a train station. Not waiting for someone, just standing. People moved around me, faces blurred, voices distant. The trains came and went, doors opening and closing. But I stayed rooted in place, not because I didn't want to leave, but because I didn't know where I would go. The destination board flickered and went blank. I woke up before it reset. The next morning, I stood by the kitchen window again, coffee in hand, watching the early light push through the clouds. It was a Tuesday, I think. The kind of Tuesday that holds no promise and no threat, just a stretch of hours waiting to be filled. Without thinking, I pulled on a coat and left the house. I didn't leave a note. I didn't bring a bag. I just walked. It had been weeks since I'd last stepped foot in the club. I wasn't sure why I went there now. Perhaps it was the only place where I had once felt like something was beginning, rather than ending. When I arrived, I stood outside for a long while, unsure if I would go in. But eventually, I pushed open the door. The scent hit me immediately: eucalyptus, sweat, rubber. It startled me how familiar it felt. At the front desk, the attendant offered a polite smile. I nodded, moved past him. He wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. I wandered through the halls slowly. The rooms echoed with the rhythmic sound of feet on mats, the clank of weights, the occasional instructor's voice giving direction. I stood near the stretching area for a moment, then sat on the edge of a bench. People moved around me, and yet I felt invisible. Not in a painful way, but in a strangely liberating one. No one knew what I had done here, who I had been. I could have been anyone. I could start over, if only for an hour. Eventually, I stood and left. Outside, the air was cool and damp. I walked without purpose, letting my feet carry me through side streets and neighborhoods I rarely visited. At one corner, I passed a bookstore I used to frequent in my 20s. I paused at the window, remembering how I used to linger there on weekends, searching for something I couldn't name in the pages of other people's stories. By the time I returned home, it was late afternoon. The house was quiet, but not empty. My daughter was in her room. I could hear the soft thump of music beneath her door. My husband was in the study, his voice low on a call. I didn't interrupt. I went to the kitchen and boiled water for tea. While it steeped, I sat at the table and stared at the chair across from me. The chair he used to sit in every morning, reading headlines aloud as if they mattered more than the silence between us. The kettle whistled softly. I poured the water, added a slice of lemon, and brought the mug to my lips. I thought of leaving. Not in a dramatic way. No packed bags, no final declarations. Just going. Quietly. Slipping out into the world as if I had always belonged elsewhere. But I didn't move. Not yet. Instead, I opened a notebook and began to write. Not about him. Not about her. About myself. Not who I had been, but who I might still become. The words came slowly, unevenly, but they came. Line after line, I started mapping the interior of my own silence. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt something shift inside me. Not regret. Not guilt. A beginning. Or the possibility of one. I woke up early on a Sunday, not because I had to, but because something inside me refused to sleep any longer. The house was still, suspended in that quiet hour before the world begins to stir. I pulled a sweater over my shoulders and walked barefoot to the kitchen. Outside, the sky was gray, but not unkind. The kind of gray that offered softness rather than gloom. A hush. I made coffee and drank it slowly, standing by the window, watching as the neighbor's dog paced across their lawn. The ordinary details of the morning gave me something to hold on to, something small, something real. When I finished the last sip, I walked to the hall closet and pulled out an old box. I knew which one. I had passed by it for years, always meaning to sort through it and never doing so. Inside were fragments of my early adulthood, letters, postcards, notebooks, even a few photographs. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and let the memories come in. There was a note from a college roommate, folded into quarters, yellowed at the edges. A photograph of me and my husband, years before the house and the child and the silence. We were laughing. His hand was on my knee. There was warmth in the way we leaned toward each other, as if we hadn't yet learned to pull away. I held the photo for a long time. I didn't cry. Grief, I'd learned, didn't always come in waves. Sometimes it settled like dust, so light you could almost ignore it, until it coated everything. Eventually, I put everything back in the box except the photo. I carried it with me to the bedroom and placed it on the windowsill. Not as a monument. Just as a reminder that once, we had known how to reach for each other. Later that morning, my daughter appeared in the doorway of the kitchen while I was peeling oranges. She looked tired. Her sweatshirt hung loose on her shoulders, and her hair was pulled up in a hasty bun. We hadn't spoken more than a few words since the night of the birthday. She sat down without a word, watching me work. "I'm not mad at you," she said finally, voice low. I kept peeling. "You should be." She shook her head. I was. But it's more complicated than that. I finished slicing the last orange and placed it on a plate between us. We ate in silence for a few moments, the fruit cold and sharp on my tongue. I think I was angry because I saw myself in you, she said after a while. And I didn't want to. I looked at her, really looked, and saw a young woman trying to navigate her own shame. Her own secrets. And I understood. Not everything, but enough. I didn't mean for it to be like this, I said. I know. We didn't hug. There was no dramatic reconciliation. Just shared breath across a kitchen table, and two people willing, for once, to see each other without defense. That afternoon, I took a long walk. Not to escape, but to return to myself. The air smelled like wet leaves and chimney smoke. I passed a group of children riding scooters, an elderly couple sitting on a bench, a teenager humming to herself through headphones. Life continued, oblivious and relentless. When I came home, my husband was in the backyard, trimming the hedges. He looked up as I opened the sliding door, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. "Looks good," I said. He nodded. It needed doing. I stood at the edge of the porch, unsure whether to step down. He didn't move toward me. We were two people bound by history, but not by proximity. "I'm thinking about going away for a while," I said. His clippers paused in midair. "Where?" "I don't know yet. Somewhere quiet. I just need space to think." He nodded again, slower this time. "I'm not leaving forever," I added. "I didn't think you were." That was all. No argument. No guilt. Just an understanding that the version of us we had protected for so long no longer needed protecting. Inside, I packed a small bag. Just the essentials. A few books. A sweater. A journal. No itinerary. No deadline. Before I left, I wrote a note for my daughter and left it on her pillow. Just a few lines. Enough. Then I drove. Not far. A few hours to a cottage a friend had once mentioned. She gave me the key without asking questions. The cottage was simple. Wooden floors. A single bedroom. A porch that looked out over a lake too wide to see across. I spent the first 2 days doing nothing. Drinking tea. Staring at the water. Letting the noise inside me settle. I read. I wrote. I let myself miss things without judgment. The smell of home. The clatter of dishes. The weight of my husband's body in bed beside me. But I didn't wish myself back. One night, as the sun sank behind the trees, I lit a candle and sat at the edge of the dock. The water reflected the sky in fractured gold. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called out. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and closed my eyes. I wasn't healed. I wasn't whole. But I was beginning. And sometimes, that's enough. I spent 5 days at the cottage. On the 6th, I returned. My daughter met me at the door. She hugged me, quickly, tightly. Said she was glad I came back. My husband was in the kitchen. He poured me coffee. Asked how the lake was. We didn't talk about anything else. But something had shifted. The silence between us wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a bridge. And that was where I chose to begin again.